So, friends, let me welcome all of you once again to the TWN webinar series on various issues related to access to medicine. So, this is a second part of our webinar we organized with AccessIBSA related to the access to Biologics. So this is in a way, taking forward one of the joint publication by TWN and IBSA on issues around biologics. Uh, so this is the second part. This mainly focus to trying to answer a larger question that is whether we do have generic molecules or biosimilars. Kind of a we cannot call it as a biogenerics, but a biosimilar, which is a kind of a non-originator production of biotherapeutics. We do not have that kind of regulatory pathway for vaccines. So, is there a science and technological possibilities to move towards that? So, this is the question we try to answer. My colleague at DWN, Chetali Rao, and me try to explore this question. Of course, it's a very preliminary stage. So this is what our thought. We put it out in this paper. So now we do have the wonderful panel of speakers. I don't want to extend it further. So let me invite Achal to take it forward to introduce the speakers, and then we go ahead with the uh, webinar. So I think let me introduce Chetali and go ahead, or Achal, you are
Thanks,
going to.
Gopa. I think I can take it from here. I'll start off.
Yeah.
I can take it from here.
Yeah, please.
Thanks so much. In the interest of time, welcome everyone. My name is Achal Prabhala. I'm the co-author of a new report we'll be discussing here today. And before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to tell you a little bit about why we're talking about drug regulation. For those of us who've worked on access to medicines before, we are used to thinking of monopolies in one way, through intellectual property, through patents. But today, we're here to tell you about how drug regulation, the system that approves drugs for safety and efficacy, can be a significant monopoly barrier too. And that this deserves our scrutiny because it's not a barrier that historically we've understood very well. A quick note on terminology. Biologics is a scientific category that includes vaccines. In our paper and in this webinar, we'll use the popular ways in which these words are deployed. Biologics, largely to refer to non-vaccine biologics, as distinguished from vaccine biologics. Now, why do drug regulation monopolies matter? We live in an imperfect world, and especially after the pandemic, it's now self-evident that biologic drugs like the monoclonal antibodies that were used to treat COVID and vaccines did not reach everyone everywhere in the world. Many of us on this webinar are from India, where few or no monoclonal antibodies were made available to us, and no mRNA vaccines ever, including now, have been made available to us. This happened because makers of the mRNA vaccines did not supply us, furthermore, did not license any partners in this country to make their vaccines, much less facilitated technology transfer to anyone in this country, despite evidence that there were multiple capable manufacturers. So in a situation where there is little or no supply, no licensing, and no technology transfer, the ability of a follow-on or a generic biologic or vaccine to enter the market is crucial. And this is where drug regulation comes in. The more expensive it is and the longer it takes, the less the chances are that we can have them at all. So this is the status quo, but there are hopeful signs that it can change, and we are here to discuss how some of that change can happen. First speaker is Chetali Rao. Chetali is a global health, innovation, and legal expert who works on equitable access to medicines and health technologies. She's a biotechnologist and intellectual property and international trade lawyer with over 19 years of experience in pharmaceutical research and development and legal and policy analysis. Over to you, Chetali, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Achal and Gopa, for the introduction. And I think in the paucity of time, I'll just jump up to what we are thinking about increasing access to non-vaccine biologics. So in the last webinar, my colleagues touched upon the patent aspect of it. And let me just now move on to why we are talking about biologics, basically. This is just a preliminary slide where it's just that biologics are one of the most powerful tools that have transformed the way diseases are being treated. And I'm not talking only about monoclonal antibodies, which are listed on the left-hand side, a few of it, but I am also talking about a lot of transformative therapies that are listed and are about to come. For example, the gene therapies, CAR T cell therapies, the cancer vaccines. So we have diseases like spinal muscular atrophy, where there were no cures, and now the transformative treatments that have come forward, like Zolgensma and Spinraza, have not only transformed the way in which the patients have increased their life expectancy, but also the quality of lives. But are we really talking about equities in access to biologics? Because there is certainly health inequities which have where disadvantaged groups do not have access to healthcare, and biologics definitely top the list of those medicines. And it is very difficult to obtain access to these medicines because these are super expensive, and also because without any coverage assistance, it is very, very difficult for people to afford these medicines. So the slide on the left-hand side clearly tells us that 80% people have access to these monoclonal antibodies in US, Canada, and Europe, while only 20% have access to these in ROWs. Additionally, we also have in the middle image, it's clearly visible that we have infectious diseases like RSV, where the biologics medicine MAB was approved in 1998, and 99% of the sales from these MABs comes from developed countries like US and Europe, while 99% death occurs in LMICs, where no biosimilars are available, and where none of these medicines have been listed in the essential health medicine list. We also had the recent paper from WHO 2 weeks back, where it clearly talked about the monkeypox crisis, where it definitely talked about the inequities where deaths are occurring in DRC, but most of the vaccines are currently stockpiled with all the developed countries. So we can clearly see that there's a lot of inequities in the biologics areas and vaccines. So where does biosimilars step in all this? Biosimilars provide value to all the stakeholders that we have. For example, more access to these biosimilars will increase the number of these new transformative therapies that will be available to patients. At the same time, if I talk about cost savings that are there, the cost savings in US from switching to biosimilars has been in the range of 44 to 69%, and UK have saved close to 500 million euros in the last 5 years by switching to infliximab. So this is the proposition and the value that biosimilars bring to the market. But as Achal just talked about, the biosimilar market and the development process is currently rigged by a lot of factors, prominent among them being patent thickets, which we talked about in the last webinar, and then the most important one being the regulatory barriers and the high cost of development. Now, both these factors are very, very intertwined with each other, because regulatory barriers are kind of one of the tools that have resulted in high cost of development. So if we talk about one of the McKinsey reports that is listed on the right-hand side, it clearly said that of the 100 to 300 million that goes into the development of a biosimilar, more than 50% of it is due to the clinical trial. 50% of the time and cost is because of the clinical trials that happen. So what did WHO and the regulatory bodies did about to bring changes to make these biosimilars and these drugs more accessible? So at the 67th World Health Assembly, WHO passed a resolution that it will take into account the technological advancements that have happened in the biotherapeutic field and put forward the revised guidelines to the revised guidelines to biosimilars. But after the resolution was passed from 2014 to 16, the expert committee on biological standardizations actually did consultations with the regulators and came up with the fact that no need for the revision of the guidelines was there, though there was a lot of technical advancements related to that. After 2014 to 16, after there was quite a bit of lull on this, an expert committee was convened by TWN and South Center in Geneva in 2018, where a lot of scientists actually got together and submitted a scientific memo to the ECBS to reconsider the waiver of clinical trials. And this was all based on scientific literature as well as advancement in technologies that were happening in the field of biologics. So after the submission of the memo again, the ECBS rejected the demand for the revision of the biosimilar guidelines. But at that time, WHO stepped in and said that they will go forward with the revision of the biosimilar guidelines, and consequently in March 2021 and in November 2021, two consultations were elicited, and finally we got a revised set of guidelines coming up in 2022. This revised set of guidelines was preceded by another major development, transformative treatment that happened in another developed jurisdiction, the UK MHRA, and both the WHO and the UK MHRA gave a clear call to increase the availability of and affordability of biosimilars by doing away with two major regulatory barriers that were one of the most important factors for increasing the cost of the biosimilars. So as we all know, in the left-hand side, there are four processes or stepwise approach that is generally followed for the development of a biosimilar pathway. So we have an analytical characterization where which are all lab techniques to determine the biosimilarity of the product with the reference product. We have the non-clinical or the animal studies. We have clinical phase 1 studies, and then we have the clinical studies. So based on the science and experience, it has now paved the way for a streamlined biosimilar development where animal studies there is an obviation of the animal studies as well as the obviation of human phase 3 clinical trials. Now, what has been and this has not only happened in these two jurisdictions, a lot of regulatory changes are in a lot of other national regulatory authorities. For example, the UK FDA did away in last December with the need for animal trials, and this September as well, workshops were being held by the US FDA to look at the possibilities of doing away with the mandatory clinical trials for biosimilars. So we have a lot of developed jurisdictions also moving towards the same path, all because it has been based on scientific evidence. So what has been the impact of these changes that have happened? The changes that have resulted in substantial reduction in data burden for the biosimilar manufacturers. So consequently, as we just talked about, based on the McKinsey studies, both the doing away of the animal and the comparative clinical efficacy studies will help in reducing the cost and developmental cost and timelines of the biosimilars. So like it was quoted, 50% is the cost that goes into the production of goes into clinical trials. So we have a 50% reduction there. Plus we have an additional reduction in terms of animal studies and a 2/3 reduction in developmental cost lines. So this will definitely help to increase the feasibility of the biosimilars in the coming ways. So what next should be done? The major important step that should be done that the NRS should actually emulate the powerful regulatory changes that have been brought about by the UK MHRA and the WHO guidelines. And all this science-based regulatory streamlining will not only increase the number of biosimilars increase the number of biosimilars that will be available for the originator transformative biological therapies that are currently in practice. Additionally, the regulatory reliance can also increase a lot of patient access in LMICs, because currently the inequities in terms of monoclonal antibodies as well as the new therapies that are coming up is very, very evident there's a telling tale in cases of LMICs. It will also increase the access to a lot of patients, and also the increase in competition in the biosimilar markets by reduction in both the cost and the timelines will generally bring about a lot of savings in terms of health priorities. So this now brings me to the one of the last slides that I will be discussing, is that we just saw the regulatory movement that happened in case of the regulatory movements that happened in case of biologics. It took 8 long years. Hard battles were there. The battles were lately done. things could have been done much better, with much effectiveness and with much alacrity. We do have a science-based approach to removing these changes. These are not cutting corners, because a lot of consultations, a lot of science-based technology movements have happened. There is a powerful scientific backing in all these things. So it took 8 long years, and the most impact of this was the inability of the people in LMICs and in the developing countries to access to these transformative technologies, which their counterparts in all the other developed countries were able to get. So I think COVID-19 has taught us a lot of lessons with respect to how the biosimilarity in vaccines can work. We have a lot of scientific traction gaining currently, that biosimilarity concept can be applied to vaccines. We've seen the regulatory pathway being shortened in the case of the vaccines that were approved in mRNAs, in terms of mRNA technologies. So I think now this slide acts actually as a springboard for my next discussant, Achal, to come forward and look at how we can apply the concept of the biosimilarity that we put up in biologics to the vaccines. Hand over to Achal now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chetali. I appreciate this. I just want to begin by recapping what Chetali said. Non-vaccine biologic drugs have seen a tremendous movement in the way their regulation and the guidelines recommended for their regulations have changed. And if we were to sum it up crudely, the development cost and time to bring a biosimilar to market as a result of these new guidelines is something like 2/3 what it used to be, both in terms of cost and in terms of time. There's still a lot left to be done. As Chetali said, it took several years for the WHO to issue revised guidelines. That was prompted in part by developed countries like the UK taking this into their own hands and doing their thing before the WHO provided these new guidelines. And now it's up to us in countries like India and other centers of biosimilar production to change national laws and policies, to revise them and bring them in line with the new WHO guidelines. So there's still a lot left to do, but there has been this big change by global public health authorities, such as the World Health Organization, providing new guidelines that could dramatically increase our access to biologics by dramatically lowering the development cost and time that it takes to bring a biosimilar to market. However positive these developments are, there have been no similar movements in vaccine regulation. And this is something that should concern us all. The higher the cost and the longer the time it takes to bring a follow-on, or dare we say generic vaccine to market, the more impossible it becomes. This is something that we experienced firsthand through COVID. For new vaccines, in the absence of a formal license and technology transfer, our regulatory systems, almost anywhere in the world, require the full replication of the clinical trials process. This is a major cost and time barrier, and it also confers a de facto monopoly, a permanent monopoly, if you will, to originator vaccines. Yet there are numerous potential pathways to rationalize the vaccine regulatory approval process without compromising on safety or trust. The guardianship of both, which are, of course, the primary functions of regulatory agencies. There are two hopeful signs. The first is the idea of running immunobridging studies. In December 2021, for instance, the European Medicines Authority, which is one of the most developed and well-respected regulators in the world, approved a COVID booster vaccine from Sanofi on the basis of immunobridging studies. That is to say, trials that numbered in the hundreds rather than in the thousands. Two trials separately, one to evaluate its efficacy as a primary dose and the other to evaluate its efficacy as a booster dose. Sanofi had to conduct full safety trials, but beyond that, there was an abbreviated pathway that was offered, which was taken up, on the basis of which this vaccine was approved. Now, it is therefore clear that it is possible for us to have biomarkers of immune efficacy, and that this is a potential measure of equivalence that we can use across vaccines, across targets, across technological platforms. In some cases, we might be able to develop more solid markers of this equivalence, such as immune correlates of protection or other markers of immunogenicity. But it does seem, even in the case of new vaccines for new targets, that it is possible to develop a system by which one can have trials that measure non-inferiority, rather than impose this burden of replicating the full suite of clinical trials from start to finish every time we have a follow-on vaccine in a market for a target for which there is already an efficacious vaccine that exists. Other than this, it is also evident that we haven't taken full advantage of the newest and arguably the most brilliant technology to have emerged during the COVID pandemic, which is messenger RNA technology. The mRNA technology platform has been vaunted over the years as we've understood it better, moving from a more shallow understanding of it through the rather high efficacy numbers reported by the first two mRNA vaccines from BioNTech and Moderna, to understanding its revolutionary potential for manufacture, the very small industrial footprint that it requires in order to be made, which has led to hugely respected and potentially revolutionary projects such as the WHO's mRNA technology transfer program. But it's possible that there are still other ways in which perhaps we haven't exploited the value of mRNA technology in full. And one of those ways is likely in the regulatory sphere. The genius of mRNA technology is that it eliminates the need for cell-based biology in the production process. It's not part of the platform, it's not part of the technology. And that in turn eliminates a large degree of the unpredictability and the variability that characterizes biological pharmaceuticals. Given the synthetic nature of the product and the process, it is very likely that there are numerous ways by which we could explore the idea of equivalence, how to be able to measure that, either with smaller human trials or a combination of in vitro and human trials. But that would require us to pay some attention to this, to understand that there is significant potential to create this equivalence, and then put scientific effort and thought into understanding how, in a situation where, as we've seen in the pandemic, access to mRNA therapeutics, however miraculous they are, have been severely limited, and that doesn't look like it's going to change for the next vaccine or therapeutic that comes up on this platform, how we can create ways through the regulatory system by which we can allow for follow-on mRNA products to be more easily available to all of those who didn't get them this time around. I'll stop there and hand over to the first of our three invited guests who we are delighted to have with us. Michel de Wilde has had a long career in vaccine research and development. He was Senior Vice President, Research and Development at Sanofi Pasteur, where he drove the development and licensure by the FDA and other regulatory bodies of a number of products, including the Sanofi dengue vaccine. Prior to joining Sanofi, Michel was at SmithKline Beecham Biologicals, which is now GSK Vaccines, where he was Vice President, Research and Development, and played a key role as a research scientist in the development of several new vaccines, most notably the recombinant hepatitis B vaccine, as well as GSK's malaria vaccine candidate. Michel is also on the STEERCO, or the steering committee of the WHO's mRNA technology transfer program, and brings therefore a public-oriented focus in addition to his work in the private sector. Welcome, Michel. We've talked about this before, and the last time we did that was with, I think, Drew Weissman and Kiat Rakuntham in Thailand, where Kiat was developing his own mRNA vaccine at Chulalongkorn University. And I know that you have thought about this for a while now. We'd love to hear what you think about the opportunities that are available for regulatory change that might create greater access to vaccines.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you also for inviting me. I'm conscious of the time running very fast, so I'll make only 3 points that I list up front. One is the connection between the regulatory authorities and the broad acceptance or non-acceptance hesitancy of a vaccine. The second one is on the dramatic evolution of vaccine or vaccinology sciences and how it applies to regulatory processes, if you wish, regulatory science. And my last point is that as you already sort of indirectly alluded to, the solution may be dependent on the actual vaccine platform you're talking about. Concerning the first point, I think it's absolutely critical that the regulatory authorities of any country or any group of country has the credibility and has this role in ensuring that the public trust the vaccine. So as we work on accelerating regulatory pathways, we want to be absolutely sure, also from a communication point of view, that we don't give the impression that we are sort of sloppy or, taking shortcuts. So that's an important consideration that's addressed, I think, mostly because the country need to really ensure that their authorities are at the highest level of competencies and state-of-the-art understanding. The progress in vaccine science has been, of course, tremendous, not only in the way we make our vaccine, but also the way we characterize them. And there has been enormous progress in things like system vaccinology, where we can, to extreme detail, look into a few human beings, compare immune reaction to extreme detail. That's from the immunological point of view. But from the physical point of view, the techniques to actually characterize a product have also tremendously evolved. And of course, that's critical when we're talking about biosimilar, if not bio-better, by the way, to make sure that what we reproduce is exactly what we are copying. And my last point is indeed on platforms. And it was mentioned. I think the spectrum between a live vaccine or a very complicated vaccine, like, for instance, conjugate vaccine, where protein are conjugated chemically to protein carriers. And with the other extreme, as Achal mentioned, mRNA, which are essentially chemicals and can be characterized as almost small molecules and other chemical entities, really open the pathway to very precise characterization and reducing to a maximum, without taking any risk, the amount of actual clinical data we need to make sure we're doing things right. So in the rest of time, I will just stop there.
Thank you so much, Michel. Really appreciate this. Just moving on, because we're a little strapped for time and some of our guests have to leave early. I welcome Soumya Swaminathan, who is the chairperson of the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation in Chennai, in India, which is in South India, by the way, I should just say, which is very important to me. She was most recently WHO's chief scientist, before that Deputy Director General for Programs. As WHO's inaugural chief scientist, she played a key role in the pandemic in coordinating scientific efforts at the WHO, as well as setting up COVAX. with a focus on equitable vaccine distribution. Soumya is a pediatrician from India and a globally recognized researcher on tuberculosis and HIV, with 30 years of experience in clinical care and research, including serving as Secretary to the Government of India for Health Research and serving as the Director General of the Indian Council for Medical Research. In addition to all of this, Soumya originated the WHO's mRNA Technology Transfer Program, which is arguably one of the most ambitious public health projects in the world, and in my opinion, one of the best things that came out of the otherwise rather dire pandemic that we suffered for 3 years. Welcome, Soumya. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Achal. Thank you for that very kind, very generous introduction, and great to see Michel and Barney as well. Firstly, I want to congratulate you for the paper that you've done and for raising this issue, which is, I think, quite timely, quite relevant. While I was at the WHO, I was sort of witness, though I wasn't directly involved in the regulatory side of things, but to the efforts that were being made by colleagues in TWN and others to actually progress the guidelines, on the non-vaccine biologics. And previous speakers have all spoken about why this is necessary, why we should think about doing the same for the non-biologic vaccines like the mRNA technology, and also about how this not only improves access in developing countries, but also reduces costs in healthcare in the developed world. So there are many reasons, I think, that we would like to have faster, broader access, especially with the latest technologies, and monoclonal antibodies certainly have a big scope, not just for treatment of infectious diseases, but also for non-communicable diseases, including the some of the immune-mediated diseases as well as cancer. So I don't want to repeat what others have said, but I do think that this is an area that obviously needs to be driven by the science, because in no way does anyone intend or want to dilute the regulatory process in any way or to compromise. And, as a chief scientist, I was constantly answering questions from the media, from the public, on how was it possible to develop vaccines so quickly, and how can we still have the confidence that these vaccines are actually quite safe and effective. So I think it's really important that at that time, WHO and all the regulatory agencies that had come together were able to explain to the public, were able to justify how it was possible to accelerate vaccine development and not compromise on the safety, particularly. Efficacy was important, but safety was, I think, foremost on people's minds. So I think using the same principles here, what we need to do is to dive deep into the science. And the R&D blueprint of the WHO was actually hosting and still continues to host a series of webinars. And some of them were actually on things like, what are the correlates of protection? What are the immune correlates? And this kept changing with the pandemic as to whether you can just rely on antibodies, whether you need the cell-mediated immune responses as well, the CD4 and CD8 T cell responses. And this, of course, depends, from pathogen to pathogen or disease to disease. So if you take the mRNA vaccines, for example, and the question of, what would be considered a biosimilar, and Achal gave an example of what the UK regulators had done. So what I would suggest at this point of time is that really that WHO is in a very good position to convene a series of expert discussions where the science would be laid out, and there will need to be a good examination of the data that's available, examples of how things have been done, what have been some of the consequences of the decisions that have been made by different regulatory agencies, and then come up with a framework or a recommendation or a guideline, for regulatory agencies to implement. So WHO could suggest the pathway, and of course, then the implementation is actually by the regulatory agencies. I think this is also critical because of the mRNA tech transfer program, which really is creating this network of scientists, mainly in low and middle income countries, to work on the mRNA technology and to develop therapeutics and vaccines that are needed primarily by the developing world, and where there isn't a lot of market interest and where the big companies may not necessarily be working. And so side by side with the R&D aspects and stimulating the tech transfer, there also needs to be work in parallel on the regulatory pathways and processes. Only then can access be accelerated. So this is a very good time to have this discussion. And I think that the regulatory agencies could come together, the network could take this up as a good topic for further development, but also the WHO, I believe, could play a key role here. Thank you, Achal.
Thank you very much, Soumya. I have relied on your good counsel and advice for many, many months, and I know that there are several people who appreciate everything that you say. We certainly do, and I think that there's an enormous role for the WHO to play here. We look forward to engaging more. I welcome Barney Graham. Barney, I know that you have to leave early. We'll try to make sure that you can. Barney Graham is an immunologist, virologist, and vaccinologist, recognized for his work on viral pathogenesis and vaccine development. He joined the NIAID Vaccine Research Center at the National Institutes of Health in the US as a founding member in 2000. He retired as deputy director of the VRC in 2021 and is now a professor of medicine and microbiology, biochemistry, immunology, and a senior advisor for global health equity at the Morehouse School of Medicine in Atlanta. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and was named one of the world's 100 most influential individuals and one of the heroes of the year in 2021 by Time magazine, and recognized as the Federal Employee of the Year by the Partnership for Public Service for his work on COVID-19 vaccine development. Welcome, Barney. From what you've heard here and also your own crucial and long-standing involvement in mRNA technology, what do you think about what you've heard and where this could go, Barney? This discussion on how drug regulation may be changed to truly take advantage of the benefits of the mRNA technological platform.
Yes, thank you, Achal, and thank you to everyone online. Good morning and good evening. I want to emphasize that what I've done in my career after leaving NIH is go to Morehouse School of Medicine, where I'm focused on global health equity. And the reason for that is that I was distressed at the lack of equity and the delay in getting products, effective products for COVID during the COVID crisis. But so this is my main work right now. But I also want to emphasize that vaccines are different than antibodies. Vaccines, because they are inducing an immune response in the human host, and humans have a lot of immunological variability, vaccines are much less predictable, or they're not the same in every host. And so the evaluation of safety becomes paramount. And so it puts the regulatory groups in a difficult position, because even though vaccines can be life-saving, vaccines, the way they're made and the way they induce immunity in people in a fairly large spectrum makes them more difficult to control for safety. And because you're immunizing an otherwise healthy individual, safety is the most important thing about vaccine development. Now that we have mRNA and have it precedent for mRNA and have shown that the platform itself is safe, I think that gives us a lot of new opportunities, as people have mentioned to use this platform more broadly, but to bridge, do immunobridging for efficacy is relatively more easy than doing any kind of immunological bridging for safety. And so, because safety may depend not just on the immune response, but it may depend on the process by which the mRNA is made. That maybe there's more double-stranded RNA that would cause more side effects, or the formulation, the lipids, all these details can affect immune responses and therefore affect safety. So it's difficult. And so, to me, one of the most important things that we have to address is preparation, advanced preparation. And for that, I think we need a multinational agreement, maybe even above the level of WHO, that would improve global coordination and cooperation, because not only agreements between manufacturing entities, but agreements between regulatory authorities and establish regional and maybe even global regulatory authorities and have the criteria established ahead of time. The Global Vaccine Action Plan that was started in 2012 asked that all countries, both high-income and low-income countries, have national policies for how to use vaccines, for what to do if an HIV vaccine became available. Many countries have, and that was hopefully to be done by 2020, which would have been done in time for the pandemic. Many countries still do not have those policies in place. So there has to be preparation at the policy level in government. There has to be preparation between academic and commercial entities for manufacturing approaches. There has to be agreement between regulatory agencies around the world. And so, we did achieve some things during the pandemic because of the crisis, and were able to get relatively rapid approvals of things. But you don't really know about rare vaccine side effects until you've immunized 10 million people. So, being ready for the safety considerations for new products, or even trying to establish products that are for known diseases like RSV, are going to require a lot of cooperation across continents, across borders. And for that, I think we need a multinational accord and an agreement between countries that about how we will operate in the future. And it has to be done before the next crisis.
Thank you very, very much, Bani. We appreciate that very much. We appreciate you being here. I know that some of us on this panel have to leave a little early, and if you have to, then you're welcome to do so. We have a few minutes left, about 15 minutes, to take questions from any of you here. If you have questions, you can either raise your hand and we'll call on you. You could also type them into the chat if you would prefer. And if you have a question that is directed at a specific person on this panel, please do name that person so that they can answer your question. Thank you very much, Bani, and we appreciate you being here. There are some
questions in the chat.
Sorry, Soumya. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was saying there's some questions in the chat.
That's right. There are some questions in the chat, and it's from Ratish IG, who says, when can we expect this abbreviated pathway for vaccines to be implemented in India? Which is $1 million question. Actually, perhaps that's something that perhaps that you could touch upon, Soumya, and maybe I can preface that by saying we have a robust vaccine industrial base. We have a robust biologics manufacturing base, right? There is a robust private sector which is interested in producing more vaccines and biologics. We have a regulatory system that could do with some changes. And what do you see from your experience in government and the WHO as the potential or a pathway, for instance, in India for some of this change to happen, both for access, greater access to biologics and vaccines for us, but also to the rest of the developed world?
So obviously, I cannot speak for the drug regulator or the government, but what I can say is that certainly I think the government of India has a keen interest and stake in actually supporting Indian industry, the Indian pharmaceutical industry that, as you mentioned, has been sort of the backbone practically of the supply of generic drugs and vaccines to organizations like Gavi, UNICEF, the Global Fund, etc. And we all know the story of how HIV treatment was made affordable thanks to Yusuf Hamid and Cipla and other companies in India. So I think that there's also has been a lot of discussion and a review of the Drug Controller General's office, the functions, etc., and a recognition that there are new technologies today that will need to be examined and pathways developed. And a few years ago, there was a big review. There was a change in the Act, as well as a revamp of the Central Drug Standards Control Organization. And I think that there now is a recognition and a desire to want to spur innovation, to support innovation coming from India, but also the commitments that were made, for example, during the G20 and prior to that in the pandemic, of India not only looking after India's interests, but also looking after the interests of developing countries in general, and particularly the global South. So I think this is a good time. But again, I think it's difficult for one regulator or one country to address this issue. There's also limited number of people around the world who have deep expertise in this area. And so I think it would be really good to have actually a global group of experts discuss and recommend what potential pathways are possible. And then, of course, it's for each regulatory agency to make those decisions. This is why I felt that the WHO could play a role. I agree with Barney that in many of the things that he was talking about, you might need a higher platform at which countries agree. And that's exactly what the pandemic treaty, I think, is trying to do, is to negotiate the rules of how countries would behave during a pandemic, during a global emergency. But I think in this particular topic, since it is quite technical, the WHO could take a lead, and then, of course, there could always be, if necessary, agreements at a higher political level as well.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense and actually connects to something that Michel was talking about earlier. Michel, if I may call upon you, you talked a little bit about beyond the WHO as to what countries, developed countries with high-functioning regulatory agencies could perhaps do, in the same way as the UK regulatory agency did with non-vaccine biologics even prior to the WHO guidelines, right? In fact, probably prompting some of that movement at the WHO, right? So do you have any thoughts in terms of how perhaps regulatory agencies with capacity might move, whether it's on abbreviated pathways for mRNA vaccines or just generally across the newer vaccine technologies that we have?
Well, my point was that any regulatory authorities should have and should be funded and staffed so that they have the necessary scientific understanding in order to achieve what was just mentioned by Soumya and Barney, that is a higher level, global level of understanding of what the rule should be, so that we don't have to act under pressure when during the next crisis. Right?
Thank you very much.
That is the key word, and Soumya mentioned it. It should all be science-based. And again, paying attention to the fact that these days, very unfortunately, there is a sort of an anti-science movement, like there is an anti-vaccine movement, right? So I think the communication about all that is an equally important aspect. It's not specifically what we're discussing today, but we should never keep that of mind. And I mean, there's been multiple examples, right, during the pandemic about miscommunication or failures of communication or failure of making the population understand that science evolves also. It's something we need to work equally on as part of this effort here. Otherwise, it will be perceived as, cutting corners or cheap stuff, etc. And so it's very important, the communication part.
Thank you, Michel. Actually, there's a question here in the chat, which I think leads on from what you were just saying. This is from Vinay Bothra. He says that 86% of the funding for the MHRA in the UK, that's the UK drug regulator, and 65% of the funding for the FDA in the US comes from the pharmaceutical industry. With such large-scale potential conflicts of interest, is there a need to exercise some caution before we go rushing into the seductive arms of the so-called stringent regulators for greater access to biosimilars? Is there anyone who would like to take this question?
Well, I was really, I can try, give it a shot. I wasn't aware of this precise figure, but of course here the question refers to the fees any industry who wants to license a product has to pay, right? It's user fees, which is the basis of funding some of those regulatory agencies, and especially the case in FDA. I think in this particular case, and having gone through multiple attempts, successful or not, to get product license through FDA, I mean, it's not because you have to pay for them to look at your product that there is a conflict of interest. That can, believe me, it doesn't make it easier. So I think it's how should I say? In this particular case, I don't really see the conflict of interest question, in the contrary.
Thank you very much. And perhaps there is a question here for Soumya, actually, that's related to this, which is, in your experience in public health, Soumya, whether there is a particular role that an organization such as the World Health Organization plays, which is neither connected to a sovereign interest or, in the case of the question that came up, necessarily linked to a sovereign interest, such as a regulatory agency whose funding very largely comes from the pharmaceutical industry. And it seems as though the word of the WHO can be seen as outside of partisan sovereign interests, as well as sometimes outside of corporate interest, and therefore might carry a different kind of weight. Would you think so?
I agree. I mean, I think the WHO is very neutral. It is a neutral body. It is accountable to all of its member states. And it works, of course, through constitution of expert groups. So it's not the WHO staff who make the recommendations or guidelines, but it's the expert groups that are set up, and usually they're well represented, geographically, gender-wise, etc. And it's quite transparent as well. And so this is why, in my experience, it is unusual to have vested interests really influence major decisions or policies of the WHO. So this is why I think I believe the WHO is in a good position, firstly because of their convening power, the ability to convene experts at short notice. In fact, even very busy people are willing to give their time to WHO. This is something I saw during the pandemic. And secondly, because it is really the only health normative agency globally. And so once WHO says something, there is a high level of weight given to that, high level of credibility. And usually then countries then take the next steps. But if WHO does not come up with, then sometimes countries may tend to wait, or they may tend to think that, oh, well, this is a topic that, there isn't a good evidence base to act on. So this is why it helps for WHO to come up with the guidelines that often spurs countries also to look at what policies they may need to change internally, or laws, to comply with that. So of course, the WHO recommendations are always recommendations. They are not the law, but they go a long way, I think, in convincing ministries, but also the public, I think, who gets a high level of confidence, when WHO does put out guidance.
Thank you. And I think that both with the pre-qualification project at the WHO, as well as the expert committees that are set up to investigate a particular scientific question, the WHO has that incredible capacity to give technical expertise to developing countries that do not have capacity within their sovereign borders. And can act as a kind of supranational global body of expertise and capacity on behalf of developing countries, which is such an important function. There are a couple of questions here which are which I think we can answer a little quickly. There's a question from Gillian Woollett, which is, why would access to biosimilars, which are already approved in the US, EU, and UK, not be immediate in other parts of the world, given that they comply with the WHO guidelines? So I think that that's usually not the primary concern. I think the primary concern, or the kind of thing that we're talking about here, is when biosimilars are brought to market for the first time in India, let's say, prior to the US or the EU or the UK, and what we can do in other developing countries to accelerate that process. In fact, actually, the process in the US and the EU, the UK has changed its guidelines, but neither the US nor the EU have. Chetali informs us that they're investigating it. There's a question for Soumya that is related to a patent on sofosbuvir, which I think is probably outside the scope of this seminar. So I'm going to respectfully ask Siddharth Jain to maybe hold that question for a while. There are some questions in the chat, one from Madhavi Yenapu, which perhaps we can use as the last question on this seminar, since we're running out of time. She asks, the WHO pandemic treaty is being drafted and negotiated for uniform regulatory guidelines. What is India's preparation? What is India's, sorry, I think this question has just been removed. I'm sorry, or perhaps it was answered. But I think that the question was, what is India doing at the INB and IHR negotiations in order to create streamlined regulations for pharmaceuticals that could increase access? And maybe to end this seminar, Gopa, this is a question that you might take since you're the most involved, I think, among us, and you're in fact in Geneva at the moment at the INB negotiations. So perhaps you could answer this and close our webinar out with your answer.
Yeah, thank you, Achal. And Madhvi, your question basically looking at there is no direct obligation is created, but there is a suggestion which may lead to such kind of situations. Article 14. Paragraph 2 of the draft text basically says, let me read, the party shall align and where possible harmonize technical and regulatory requirements and procedures in accordance with the applicable international standards, etc. And it goes. So the question is, it's basically suggest a lawyer may say still it is qualified, there are some elbow room, etc. But it suggests harmonization of regulatory standards. But the question comes, at what level you have to harmonize? Is it it bears the danger of, you may replicating the stringent regulatory authorities guidelines, which may bring the compliances cost further and affects the competition, because as the similar guidelines shows, the experience shows that regulatory guidelines are not only science, but it's also been used as a tool to manage competition. So therefore, there is a danger in that. But as far as access and benefit sharing is concerned, I think India, along with other developing countries, especially with the Africa group, has submitted a very good proposal. Whenever there is a sharing of pathogen involved, there should be kind of benefit sharing. It should not be a one-way traffic and free flow of information without nothing in return. So basically, India is part of a group called Group of Equity here, along with Africa group, is basically insisting that sharing should be fully in respect of access and benefit sharing obligations under CBD and Nagoya Protocol. Yeah, let me stop. So of course, this danger of harmonization is there. Yeah, that we need to be careful.
Thank you very much, Gopa. Thank you to every one of you who attended. We really appreciate you being here.